Perfect. So here we go. So today we're going to be talking about modern slavery. We were initially going to do kind of like a fair trade fortnight presentation, fair trade fortnight, and it kind of evolved to a modern slavery presentation, which I'll touch on why in a bit. But yeah, hopefully it's exciting to see so many people here and keen to learn more about modern slavery. We like to give a little disclaimer as part of our ACTS presentations that we are no experts. So I'm definitely not an expert in modern slavery. This is something that I've just learnt recently about. So if I miss something or you want to clarify something or add something onto what I've said, then please feel free to jump in. And yeah, this is really just an introduction session, just scratching the surface. You'll understand why when we get into it a bit, that it's a very big topic, but hopefully this gives you, as Ree said, a good starting point for starting to educate yourself a bit more about modern slavery. So I just wanted to start with this quote here. This is a quote from President Lincoln about the abolishment of slavery in America. America definitely wasn't the first or last country to abolish slavery, but I wanted to put it in just to kind of set the scene. And it is a famous quote that people associate with slavery. So this was from 1865, and I think a lot of people think that, you know, along with this, that slavery's been abolished for a really long time, but it's actually been around for all of modern human history. So we really need to change the way that we think about slavery. Just to start with the basics, so what is slavery, or what is a slave? A slave is someone who is under the power of another, who exercises the rights of ownership over them. So essentially, a slave has no control over their own life. This is just a little bit of a context slide just to show you what we're going to be talking about today. So real brief touch on the history of slavery, and going into modern slavery and looking at modern slavery globally, and then kind of honing into on a bit of an Australian-New Zealand context before looking at modern slavery in the textile industry, and then lastly, what we can do. So history of slavery, I just really wanted to touch on. It's really long and messy. It spans across thousands of years and across continents as well. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when it started, but it is reportedly around 11,000 years ago. One of the reasons that it is so hard to pinpoint is that it's been around since before we actually were recording and scribing events and knowledge. Despite this, we do know that it didn't occur as part of hunter-gatherer societies, just because of the way those groups interacted. This brings us to Mesopotamia. This is an ancient region which today is known as Iraq and Turkey and a couple of neighbouring countries. This is where the first city-state emerged, so that's why it's thought to be the birthplace of slavery. So as we became more civilised, there was land ownership, cities started to develop, farms started to develop. We had a need for agriculture and then people to work on these farms. And so slavery came as a result of debt or birth into a slave family or child abandonment, war or punishment for a crime, things like this. At the onset, the slave trade wasn't a particularly booming global business, sorry. So if you had a slave, you'd have to give them regular care, so food, clothing and shelter and these kinds of things. This obviously changed over time, throughout the Middle Ages, especially where there was more global and conquering and warfare. So the slave trade grew. The legal ownership of people has been abolished globally, with Mauritania, which is in Northwest Africa. This was the last country to do so, not till 1981. So not that long ago, and even despite this, it's still really prevalent across the globe, with almost half countries not yet criminalising it. So I just wanted to put a question to all of you, just to put in the chat. I just want you to kind of think about what you think modern slavery looks like, and you can just type your answers in. So, it could be maybe people in chains, or people working long hours, or with low pay, or in sweatshops, things like this. I just kind of wanted to get an idea of what comes to mind when you think about modern slavery. So, Ree? Yeah. Women, definitely. Children, yeah. People aren't fairly paid, young children, factories. Yeah, people compelled to work, definitely. Sweatshops, long hours, bad conditions, definitely. Lack of freedom, Black Lives Matter, people unaware of their employment rights. Yes, all these things are really great. I definitely know for me that sweatshops was always the first thing that came to mind. I think that's something a lot of people hear about. There's a lot of other places that slaves are forced to work as well, which you can get into. Plantation work, yep. Great. So thank you, everyone. Employees had their passports taken off them. Exactly right. Visa status threatened, forced labour. Yes. So thank you for everyone for having that. It seems like everyone kind of has a bit of an idea about modern slavery already, which is really great. And now I want you to picture your own workplace. So, are you able to go to the toilet? Are you able to eat or take breaks, take sick days, or are you able to leave, earn a basic wage, have weekends, spend time with your family, all these kinds of things that you are entitled to, and it would be, you wouldn't even question that you are entitled to these things. Unfortunately, modern slavery removes this for people. And I really wanted to highlight that it's not just about poor working conditions, and it's not just about low pay, although these can be incorporated into it. So you might have, heard about 7-Eleven workers or George Columbaris workers, these kinds of things that have come up in the media. But this is just kind of more worker exploitation rather than slavery. Slavery is about removing the power someone has over their own life. It's a serious global problem, and this is particularly because it's a really complex crime that's not easy to recognise. So I just have a few images here of things that maybe come to mind. I think some people did say young children and labour. So some of the things that come to mind when you think of modern slavery, young children in poor working conditions as well. It's really common. Again, people working in sweatshops or really confined spaces. And another one which I definitely didn't realise, which is such a big issue, was people working in agriculture industries, so especially cotton can be really bad as well. So enslaved people, they're not seen as people, they're actually seen as a commodity to be bought and sold. They're cheap, they require little care, and they're disposable. So anyone can be affected regardless of gender or age or race, but vulnerable people are more likely to be impacted. And this is just the definition for modern slavery in Australia's Modern Slavery Act. So when it's talking about the offence under Division 270 or 271, this is looking at criminalising slavery, which I mentioned the definition before, and slavery-like practices, which I'll go into. And it also talks about trafficking. So human trafficking, I just wanted to touch on the difference between human trafficking and modern slavery. They're often used interchangeably, but it's important to know that they are two different things. So, and also trafficking isn't just about the transportation either, which some of you might have thought. It's actually about the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring of a person by improper means for an improper purpose. So this is addressed in the Modern Slavery Act, and it sits under the definition umbrella, the modern slavery umbrella term. And then I guess you can see there's something that leads people into slavery. So Kevin Bales wrote a really great book called Disposable People about slavery and how it's evolved to modern slavery. And he talks about 3 key factors that he thinks has led to modern slavery. So we've got such an increase in global population over the past few decades, which has led millions of impoverished, desperate people to the world's labour market. There's also been economic globalisation, and modernised agriculture has dispossessed poor farmers, making them and their families vulnerable, and also rapid economic change in developing countries, which has bred corruption and violence. So this is just looking at modern slavery globally. As I said, it is really hard to measure and really hard to recognise. Despite this, it's known that modern slavery is still in around over 160 countries, and over 40 million people are struggling. You can see that, I think it was Sue that said women, so you can see that 71% are women, and then 1 in 4 victims are also children as well. So there are steps being taken by the government, so by different governments, SDGs, which I'll touch on, Modern Slavery Acts, which I'll touch on, but there's still a lack of awareness around something that is already really hard to recognise. Now you can see there's 6 countries which have significantly high numbers of slavery. India's the highest and actually has more slaves than the entire population of the Netherlands. And in India, all forms of slavery exist. This is just looking at the products in which we can import that have risks of having modern slavery in their supply chains. So this is the top 5 products, and you can see that this is linked to consumerism, and us as consumers need to educate ourselves because it empowers us to make different choices and encourage those around us, which will hopefully lead to global change. So I did mention there are different forms of modern slavery. I really can't offer more than just a brief definition for them all, unfortunately. They could all do with their own presentation themselves. They're all huge issues across the world, but I'm just going to offer a bit of a definition just so you can get an understanding about what each of them are. So there's sex trafficking, where individuals perform commercial sex through force, fraud, or coercion. There's also child sex trafficking. So this is looking at the recruitment, harbouring, transportation, provision, or soliciting of a minor for the purpose of the Commercial Sex Act. Forced labour, which is where people are employed against their will with the threat of destitution, detention, violence, or compulsion, or other forms of extreme hardship to either themselves or members of their family. And also bonded labour or debt bondage. This is when people give themselves into slavery as security against a loan, or they may also inherit this from a dead relative. Captures often claim their victims have incurred a debt from recruitment, transport, or upkeep, and this can be used to keep them in control under the promise that they might be released when it's paid off. Domestic servitude is live-in help. So domestic workers are not free to leave their employment, and they're often abused and underpaid if paid at all. And many domestic workers do not receive basic benefits, so things as simple as a day off. Then there's forced child labour, which is where children are forced to work. The work that they're forced to do deprives them of their childhood, their potential, their dignity, and it's harmful to their physical and mental development. And then there's also the unlawful recruitment and use of child soldiers. So I did mention this was going to be, this started off as being a fair trade presentation. I know that fair trade products are increasing in popularity, and awareness around fair trade is definitely increasing. I myself have heard a lot more about fair trade than I have about modern slavery. But I guess the reason that we wanted to bring it back to modern slavery is because addressing slavery is the baseline due diligence that we have for addressing human rights. So this is something that we should already be doing, and then fair trade can be seen as an addition to this. So it's looking at things like price guarantees and giving back to the community, but it is in addition to what we should already be doing to protect human rights. It's not to say fair trade is the gold standard. There are pros and cons to fair trade, just like any accreditation, but it is one of the accreditations out there, which I really like to use. But yeah, I guess I just really wanted to touch on why we weren't just focusing on fair trade, and why we wanted to open up this discussion looking at all aspects of modern slavery. So the Sustainable Development Goals, I really wanted to link show how it tied into those. So Goal 8 is about promoting sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all. It's about continuing to expand the workforce, and it looks at reducing workers in informal employment and increasing the number of women in the workforce and developing skills. So when this was put together, it had an estimation of by the year 2020, we would have 174 million unemployed people. So apparently this increases by 1 million every year. It would be much higher, now with COVID. So it will be interesting to see what that number is this year. Article 8.7 directly addresses modern slavery, which is really great. And so let's take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labour, end modern slavery and human trafficking, and eliminate the worst forms of child labour, including recruitment and use of child soldiers. So I think it's really great that they're addressing it directly in Article 8.7. And this was kind of just me thinking about the other kind of sustainable development goals we would need to address modern slavery. So it might not be included in the goals that I've listed down the bottom directly, but I think, things like no poverty or zero hunger or gender equality, I still think that these things are really important to addressing modern slavery as well. So how hard do you have to look to find modern slavery? What I really wanted to highlight here is that it isn't just in developing countries. It's obviously a lot less common in countries like Australia and New Zealand, but it does still exist. So I just got 3 separate examples from each of those countries. So in New Zealand, modern slavery predominantly takes the form of human trafficking and exploitation of workers, especially migrants. So there was a case in 2016. There was an individual on trial for human trafficking and exploitation charges. He would bring migrants from China and India on lower middle income families with the promise of work and a work visa. So unfortunately, these visas did not work, and he had these people working really, really long hours, sleeping in small lounges or basements with multiple people, and often with no bedding. They'll also threaten to be taken to the police if they made any complaints. In Australia, in 2018 alone, Anti-Slavery Australia helped over 123 people who had been trafficked to or from Australia or had faced slavery-like conditions. And these were conditions including forced marriage, servitude, and forced labour. And unfortunately, looking at Australian statistics, 4 out of every 5 modern slavery victims in Australia go undetected. There was a report of a 25-year-old woman from the Philippines. She came to work here on the promise of $800 a month to work as a domestic worker. And when she arrived, she was actually forced to work 7 days a week from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. in this couple's shop. And then at night, she was forced to do domestic work in their house. She was unable to leave this house on her own, and she was sexually assaulted multiple times a week with threats that she would go to jail if she went to the police or tried to escape. And then lastly, in the UK, this is where slaves often face forced sexual exploitation, domestic slavery, or the most common is forced labour in things like shops, nail bars, and manufacturing companies. So this is the same from Australia and New Zealand as well. It's because we want cheap products and cheap services. There was a report of a woman there. She was a general nurse in Hungary and she lost her job. So she went to London, to work as a cleaner. When she got there, she was actually forced to work in a brothel. So this was moving across private houses in residential London. And all these houses were always barred shut and everything was locked. So she was unable to escape. And if she did try, she was threatened that she would be buried under the floor unless she behaved. So she did manage to escape after 2 years. Then she found herself trapped again in a brothel before she escaped again, and she was living on the street. So it's really caused a lot of hardship for these people. Fortunately, the woman in the UK and also the woman I said from the Philippines that came to Australia, they were able to escape. And then they go on to help other people that are caught in similar situations. So these are just really, really quick examples of some of the things people are facing. I just really wanted to show that these are current times, and false employment opportunities are not uncommon. Often vulnerable people accept jobs, they accept a loan to come over, their passport is removed, which someone did put in the chat. So often people come on the promise of a visa or their passport that's removed from them so they can't leave, or they're forced to have to pay off a debt, which often isn't possible. So you hear reports of boys and men who are sent to work in construction and agriculture, but they're forced to also perform commercial sex acts. Women or young girls are offered jobs as models or nannies, waitresses and dancers. However, again, when they arrive, they're abused, threatened, and then sold into slavery. So as I said, it is a really hard thing to look out for and a hard crime to measure. There are things you can look for, which looks at the signs of modern slavery. So this is just an example for forced labour. There's anti-slavery has a link, which I'm happy to share around, which you can look at to see this, to spot the signs of slavery. So you can just look at some potential red flags. So workers seem submissive or they're afraid to speak, a lack of employment contract, they have physical injuries they can't explain, can't access their identity documents. So things like this that you can look out for if you wanted to try and see where modern slavery is in our local shops, I guess. Not local shops, but places that you go, like nail bars and things that you might not necessarily think that slavery exists at. So another question for all you listeners, what products do you think have modern slavery in their supply chains? So I mentioned I showed you the top 5 global products. So what products do you think might have high prevalence of modern slavery in our supply chains in Australia and New Zealand. For those of you that don't know what a supply chain is, it's just a network between a company and its suppliers to produce and distribute a specific product. So it's really every component along, so from the picking of the cotton to creating the fabric, to creating the textiles, putting it all together and then selling it, and then finance, customer service. So really every part. Yes, within the supply chain, sorry. So let's see, coffee, clothing, mobile phones, chocolate, electronics, cheap fashion, conflict materials, yeah. All really great. Suggestions, construction, cleaning supplies. So I think most of these are, I think most of these are on here. So let's have a look. So we'll have a look at modern slavery in New Zealand first. So it's the same for Australia and New Zealand, actually. So we've got electronics, garments, fish, rice, and cocoa. Cocoa. So a major problem for New Zealand's worker exploitation is actually that many of its biggest industries, so agriculture, hospitality, and construction, are labour intensive. So they all rely heavily on migrant labour workers. And there was an investigation into over 70 companies that showed over 2/3 had exploited workers that were operating in these industries. These individuals were forced to work long hours without breaks. So this could be up to 18-hour shifts. They were paid as little as $4 or not paid at all. So that's an hour, sorry. They didn't have things like holiday pay or holidays, and the treatment of workers was unacceptable. So this included things like verbal abuse. There's currently, from what I could find, little legislation in New Zealand which holds companies accountable for their practices within their chains. There is the Immigration Amendment Act, which aims to tackle exploitative practices by penalising employees and protecting migrant worker rights. However, there's been no independent research to determine the full extent of the problem. So, and you can see on the slide that it's low vulnerability. It was estimated from the Global Slavery Index, there's around 3,000 slaves. So that report came out a few years ago. If there is anyone listening and you do know more about modern slavery in New Zealand, then please speak up. But it looks like, it's pretty low vulnerability. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist there, but it is low vulnerability, which is really good. Looking at modern slavery in Australia, you can see that there's 15,000 victims estimated when this report came out. And these were cases of trafficking and forced marriage, sex exploitation, and labour were reported, and forced labour were reported as well. So it's a similar story where people come over on a work visa or through a temporary visa scheme, and often these are taken off them. And you can see that we've got quite a few industries that are at risk of using forced labour as well. So I did mention at the start the Modern Slavery Act. This is where I got my definitions from as well. So this is the Australian Modern Slavery Act. It commenced the 1st of Jan in 2019, and it is mandatory for companies to report on this. So an act to require some entities to report on the risks of modern slavery in their operations and supply chains, and actions to address those risks and for related purposes. So New Zealand doesn't actually have its own Modern Slavery Act, but I'll show you on the next slide companies that do need to report, and it's companies that do conduct business in Australia as well. So even though New Zealand doesn't necessarily have its own, if it has companies conducting business in Australia, they'll be impacted by this report. And you can see on this slide here, it's kind of just, what you could do as a company. So you, I can't see the first one. It's design, assess, sorry, everyone's faces is hiding it. Anyway, you guys can read that. Monitor and review and then report. And so on the next slide here, I've got who actually needs to report. So we've got Australian entities that earn over $100 million in the reporting period, and then also businesses that carry business in Australia. Companies will not be penalised for not completing this, and it doesn't have to be an overdependent insight. So it can be difficult to uphold, and companies are often not transparent, with many stakeholders of the industry having greatly differing, of any industry really, having greatly differing standards on what constitutes the length of the supply chain. Despite this, even though it's not required, because it is required, those that don't report can be named and shaped by non-government organisations. So this is where it's really important that consumer pressure puts pressure on these companies to make these reports. New South Wales does have its own Modern Slavery Act, which is really great, and that has companies reporting on a threshold of 50 million, and it also penalises companies that don't comply of up to 1.1 million. I've put a little link down the bottom there, so that's our Modern Slavery Registry for Australia, so you can go onto that, and it has some really great resources, and it will also have all the reports that companies create. I don't think there's anything on there at the moment. I think there was a 2-year grace period, but companies should be in the process of writing their reports currently. So modern slavery in the textile industry, you can kind of gather that this is, as I said, it's a global problem. It's in every industry. Really, the reason I chose the textile industry was to follow on from Ree's presentation in Plastic Free July. If you were there, it was just talking about plastic in our clothing and the environmental impact of our plastic. So I guess I just wanted to focus on this again, just to show you there's also a real social impact of your clothing. Also, the most common type of slavery, forced labour, is quite prevalent in the textiles industry as well. So I thought it'd just be a good one to have a case study on. In fact, the 3 trillion apparel and footwear industry is one of the largest that relies on forced labour. There's up to 75 million people employed in this sector, and many are paid very little or not at all. When I am talking about this industry, it definitely doesn't mean the factory is creating the clothes. It could be at any stage in the process. So there are workers in cotton and cottonseed sectors, working with silk cocoons or textiles, embellished textiles, footwear and garment sectors that are particularly vulnerable. And modern slavery is quite present in these sectors because we've got addicted to cheap clothing, and brands can make their clothing in places where labour is cheap. So this is kind of just to show you supply chain starting from cotton cultivation. So if you think about the supply chain, you can look at this slide, there's many components to it and multiple manufacturers across and within different countries. So brand owners usually work quite closely with their domestic and global suppliers, and this can be seen as their first tier suppliers. Beyond that, suppliers are often not known and exist outside their scope of influence. So this means that suppliers are outsourcing production or to other businesses without the awareness of the source of their product, and then they don't associate with having the responsibility of what goes in their supply network. So again, you can see why this is a challenging thing to monitor, and this is where companies differ in what constitutes as their supply chain as well. So really it should be what this slide is representing, but people could cut that in half. So there are a few really good reports out there. I really just wanted to highlight these two, but yeah, feel free to go and find some more reports out there on what companies are doing in regards to addressing modern slavery in their supply chains. This first report from Sandcroft looked at modern slavery in the UK. So the UK actually brought out their Modern Slavery Act prior to Australia. So some of our companies were already having to report under that. And this report was looking at the top 100 suppliers accounting for almost 30 billion of government contracts in the UK. Of these 100 companies, 90 had published a modern slavery statement, which you think is really great. However, only 58 of these statements were legally compliant. And of course, the statement alone doesn't actually reflect how your company is going to address modern slavery in the supply chain. So you really need to be careful about what companies are actually reporting on. Know Your Chain was another one. This is a not-for-profit. They developed a scoring system for companies in terms of the treatment of workers and found that out of 100, the average score was 37. So companies that were able to disclose their practices to reduce forced labour, so these could be things like hiring workers directly, these were the companies that scored well. But many either didn't have the policies or they weren't sure what they are. And this isn't just to say that just because a company is fancy or it's expensive, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have modern slavery in its supply chain. There was companies like Fendi and Dior and Celine, which were scoring quite poorly as well. So I was thinking about what company I could use just to give a little bit of a case study. I chose Zara because I feel like Zara has been in the news a bit for having modern slavery in its supply chain. There's big companies like H&M, Gap and Nike as well, which have gotten in trouble in the past for potentially having modern slavery in their supply chain or exploiting their workers. Zara is a pioneer of fast fashion, and it comes under the umbrella company of a company called Inditex, which is actually owned by a billionaire, and it's one of the biggest clothing retailers in the world. So it has a huge influence in this industry, which is why I thought it would be important to highlight. Back in 2011, there was a clothing factory in Brazil, which was subcontracted by Zara, and it was raided, and there was workers found, including children, that were earning nothing, so maybe 10 cents per piece of clothing that they were sewing, and they were working in unsafe working conditions, and so Zara was accused of slave labour. The company promised action and compensation and all these things, but 2 years later, sweatshops were raided again, and when the company denied having a relationship with these sweatshops, there was independent research into this that found that this was not the case. So Good On You is some of you might have heard it, it's an app you can use that gives different clothing brands ratings based on their environment rating, animals and people. So their rating is not good enough overall. This was really because half of its final stage of production is in Spain, which is a medium risk country for labour abuse, and it had about a 50% on the fashion industry, the Fashion Transparency Index. I really just wanted to show Zara because it's an example of a popular company. I don't know about how many people on this call, but I know a lot of people I know shop at Zara, and it just shows that we can potentially support modern slavery in companies that we don't even realise. And we're indirectly supporting that. And there are also a lot of companies that fly under the radar. So just because Zara is a big company, had a lot of attention on it, there are a number of companies as well that we don't even realise. So it's really important to start looking at these modern slavery acts and know where we're starting to buy our clothes from. So I just wanted to end on what you can do as consumers. I guess this is all about making positive changes moving forward and making conscious decisions. I feel like once you go down that rabbit hole, which I certainly did, especially with this presentation, you can start to feel guilty about things that you've done in the past, but it's not about that. It's just about trying to change your habits moving forward and, I guess trying to be a conscious consumer. So I thought, what can you do? You continue to educate yourself. This was a half an hour presentation. It's not nearly enough time for you to learn everything that you need to about modern slavery. There's plenty of really good books. I mentioned Disposable People. There's some really great documentaries. You can read up more on the Modern Slavery Act. The Walk Free Foundation is a really great resource. So that's where I got a lot of the statistics around global modern slavery statistics. And they really pushed hard for the Modern Slavery Act as well. So they're a good one to support. Have a think about where you're buying your clothes from. So our decisions really impact the global supply chain. You only have to look at the impact that COVID had on global consumption. So you have these big brands making bulk orders and they're not funding. So you can see the impact that we can have. I'm really just offering you a place to start at the moment. It's with these. So you've got the Ethical Fashion Guide, Know Your Chain, which I mentioned, and Good On You, which I mentioned. Again, somewhere to start. Take the time to understand these labels because the context can be so different and they could be looking at different things in the supply chain or the whole supply chain or, maybe just the environmental impact or the social impact. So it's really important to have a look at what they're actually reporting on, but they are a really great resource. And then lastly, just to get involved. So there's, you can donate, there's newsletters, you can demand change, sign petition. I know Amnesty International is a really great one, but there are, you can literally just go into Google and have a look at the different not-for-profits out there that are trying to reduce modern or abolish modern slavery. So what accreditations out there? What does the future look like? So there is no modern slavery accreditation. I guess you could argue, should there even be? Like, is this the bare minimum that we should be doing? And then, as I said, with fair trade, there are other accreditations that are additional. So as I said, fair trade, there's also B Corp, which is a bit more corporate. Again, different context. How can we continue to address issues of modern slavery? I personally I don't really know much about it, but I personally like the acts that New Zealand has. So a bit more pressure on companies and actually enforcing them to complete these reports. Maybe we need more independent insights into company processes as well. I know us as consumers, we really need to put the pressure on companies to have modern slavery acts. And I guess in the meantime, you just need to be empowered to make different choices. And as I said, take time to understand the labels. And moving forward, continue to educate yourself and apply pressure to companies and universities as well to submit their modern slavery acts. Yeah, I guess I kind of wanted to finish up there and open it up to anyone. So as I said, this is a new topic for me as well, but anyone who has really good resources or knows what to do, maybe in terms of connecting with university or anything like that, please, I guess I'll open the floor to you and see if you have anything that you wanted to contribute to the end of the presentation. That's it from me.
Thanks, Amelia. Just while we're waiting for anybody to maybe unmute themselves and jump in, very informative presentation. So lots of things to digest there. Sorry, I'll turn my my camera back on so that you can see me. There's a few things coming through on the chat. Apparently Puma does well in this. Puma.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's a question I'd be really keen to know, because I know a lot of the people that are involved in green impact or, you know, get involved with sustainability are already very passionate about this area. So if there are any brands or things that you are aware of that, you know, maybe the organization has looked really thoroughly into their supply chain or is accountable through their supply chain, feel free to share it with us, because as Amelia said, it can be really hard to do the research and find that information out for yourself. So if you've already done it and you already know about it, then feel free to share and let us know. Yeah, a list of brands would be good. I know there are like sort of general sustainability brands, but as Amelia said as well, a lot of those sort of ones that are flagged as sustainability focused, environmental sustainability focused, you still don't hear a lot about where, you know, they might be made out of recycled materials or sustainably sourced materials, but we still don't know how those garments or items might actually be produced. So it is a very scary area.
I feel like I've had, not necessarily kind of moving away from modern slavery, but trying to buy ethical clothing. I was, you know, thinking, I don't want to buy leather, so you got to buy non-leather shoes, but then if it's plastic, then it's bad for the environment, and then you don't know, like you think maybe because it's, I don't know, it's a lot. So if anyone does, I get overwhelmed sometimes. I just feel like I'm never going to get anything ever again. I do like secondhand clothes, but it can be overwhelming. So if anyone knows any really good ethical brands or anything like that, everything has a trade-off, Hayley, you're right, I know.
You mentioned it there, Amelia, something that I think we need to, and we talked about this in our Plastic Free July session as well, around sort of slow fashion, the movement around that, particularly like just talking about textiles. Like IT is a whole other like ball game that we haven't even really touched on, but mobile phones and computers and laptops and like the disposable nature we have with those is a very big area for this as well. But yeah, secondhand clothing, we've just about to move into October, which is Buy Nothing New Month. So it's a really great campaign to get involved with, just to remember that we do have op shops and we have a lot of opportunities to get really good quality secondhand items now through, you know, Marketplace and Gumtree and all those sorts of online sharing things. So maybe thinking about trying not to buy something new. If you need something, trying to source it secondhand, because at least you're not driving that new consumerism and that product's already there and existing. So
yeah, definitely op shops. I love op shops. Someone says Depop. I know Marketplace. I haven't heard of Depop. It sounds really great. Set up like Instagram. Might have to give that a go.
Sustainable and ethical fashion trends tends to be really expensive. Yeah, that comes back to Hayley's point. There's a trade-off. You can probably get something that's been handmade from, you know, ethically sourced and grown materials, but you will pay for it. That is the thing with fast fashion, is that it's cheap and nasty, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's where it can be. You can find some really great things in op shops. It's definitely going to be possible for everyone. I've become the person in my friendship group that just takes everyone's secondhand clothing. So I just take all that, and if I don't want it, donate it on. So it's kind of good if you can, you know, share your clothes with your friends and things like that. And yeah, but I completely understand it is hard to buy some ethical clothing. Sometimes it can be really expensive. Things like organic cotton and things like that always up the price as well. But I guess, yeah, just keeping this open conversation and sharing, sorry, it's my phone ring, and sharing, yeah, where we're making our purchases from and if we find anything really good to use.
I've also, something else has popped up in the chat, which secondhand September, which I haven't actually heard of before. So you could do secondhand September and then move into buy nothing new October, and then heading into the festive season. Another great opportunity to have an impact here is to really consider the gifts that we give in the festive season. And we will be running an Acts of Connection in a couple of weeks' time around sustainable or DIY gift giving, because again, it's all about one of the biggest things we can do is think about how we consume and what we consume. And that doesn't just address modern slavery, it addresses waste and all sorts of other really important environmental areas as well. Lots of comments coming through on the chat. Nobody wants to speak up, so it's just Amelia and I going backwards and forwards, but that's all right.
Ray, I think you can save the chat. So everything that people have linked in, I'm happy to write it up and share that around in an email for everyone that's attended if you're worried that you might have missed something.
Yeah, and some of the gift ideas that are coming through, we literally, for the Acts of Connection that we're doing, we are going to ask you to submit your ideas around sustainable and DIY gifts, and then we'll be building a live demonstration around your ideas. So if you've got something that you make or that you know of, keep it in mind, because we'll be putting a call out for that really soon. And I think that's going to be a really fantastic session as we head into the gift giving season, because unfortunately we're all really, I think a lot of people are conditioned that we must give gifts at Christmas time, and we must, or even, you know, for birthdays and all these other things, times in the year, which is something that it's okay to not do that. Or if you do, really think about what you are giving. But anyway, we've kind of like diverged into a very specific conversation point there.
But yes, Sue, I will compile that and send that round.
And I really wanted to send a big thank you to Amelia. She's been researching modern slavery madly to put this presentation for you all today. So I hope you learned something new and take something away from the session today. I know I certainly have. And thanks, Amelia, for articulating this really complex issue in such a clear and thorough way. All right, I think a few more things. We will see if we can export the chat and make sure we don't miss any of the goodies in there. But otherwise, unless anybody's got any final thoughts or contributions they'd like to make, I mean, you're welcome to unmute yourself. We might wrap up for today.
I've just saved it. Here we go. Save chat. There we go. Done. And thanks, everyone. Thank you for coming. Oh, Sue, that's a good question. I was going to ask you this, Sue.
Sorry, Amelia, I will unmute myself then. I think that would be a really good idea, because I think a lot of people, even though we work in sustainability and most of us will touch on modern slavery to some degree with our procurement teams, I think it would be really good to actually delve into this topic a little deeper and see how our institutions tracking and, you know, where we're at. So I'd be happy to sort of input into something like that in the future.
Definitely. Like, especially after doing this, I was like, I need to find out what we're doing and put the pressure on.
Yeah.
It will be interesting to see which universities start reporting under the Modern Slavery Act. So as Amelia said, that's a relatively new act in Australia. At the least, it was only introduced at the end of 2018. And there was a 2-year grace period before institutions that earned over that $100 million threshold were required to report. But even so, there were no real penalties for institutions or organisations that chose not to report under the Modern Slavery Act. So now that we're moving out of that grace period, it will be, I think it will be very interesting to see which institutions start reporting. And I know that some are doing work in this area, like, RMIT, Hayley, you beat me to it. I was just going to say RMIT are really delving into modern slavery and trying to be accountable for that in their supply chain. So hopefully we see other universities following RMIT's lead as well. Oh, fantastic. 3 representatives from University of Western Australia are working on their modern slavery report as well. So that's really good to hear. So hopefully this is something that ACTS will be able to share throughout our network as well, as people start reporting against modern slavery.
Great.
Fantastic. All right. Shall we wrap it up there?
Sure. Great. Thanks for coming, everyone. Thank you.
Amazing. Good afternoon to everybody. Good morning. Oh no, we're in afternoon in UWA. Sorry, from WA now. Bye, everybody.
Bye.